At 1:34:45 a.m. at Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, a $500 million universal translator was taken out in an instant. The BACN ground station did not simply erupt under pressure, it disappeared in a blinding wash of heat and light. One of the first Qiam-1 ballistic missiles used a maneuverable re-entry vehicle to correct its path in the final moments, driving straight into a precise cluster of satellite arrays. This was not a random strike, it was a calculated effort to remove America's eye in the sky. Military planners often assume that the more advanced a system is, the harder it is to disable. But in the case of the BACN ground station, its enormous cost and unmistakable electronic signature made it easier to find, easier to track, and easier to target. Within moments, a coordinated sequence of Qiam-1 and Fateh 313 missiles tore through the hardened communication modules, reducing one of the U.S. Air Force's most sophisticated data link systems to useless wreckage. The biggest danger for any battlefield nerve center is not always a cyber attack or digital sabotage. Sometimes the real weakness is much simpler. It exists in a known place on a map. This is the story of a major intelligence breakdown that left America's universal translator exposed, and of the mysterious high-tech response whose remains were later found abandoned in the Iraqi desert. And if the debris of a secretive two-stage ghost missile discovered in 2024 is any indication, the lesson may finally have been learned. How to strike back without leaving a clear return address. Minutes earlier, the first wave of Iranian Qiam-1 ballistic missiles had already crossed over the Zagros Mountains. The Qiam-1 is a finless, liquid-fueled threat designed for speed and reduced visibility. By removing stabilizing fins, Iranian engineers lowered its radar profile to something closer to a small blip on a screen, while also increasing the speed of the re-entry vehicle. At Al-Assad, there was no MIM-104 Patriot battery waiting to intercept them. Intelligence had suggested Iran would avoid a direct state-on-state ballistic strike. That assumption collapsed first. The target was a tightly grouped collection of windowless containers and satellite arrays. The ground station for BACN, the Battlefield Airborne Communications Node. Inside those containers, the U.S. Air Force's so-called universal translator was processing massive streams of data. BACN is the system that allows an F-22 Raptor to exchange information with a ground commander's tablet, or a Navy destroyer to share radar data with an Army artillery unit. It connects platforms that otherwise speak completely different digital languages. When the first Qiam-1 warhead hit, that bridge was gone. Then came the next phase. After the Qiam-1 impacts, Fateh 313 missiles entered their terminal dives. The Fateh 313 is a solid fuel precision weapon built for speed and surprise. Unlike liquid-fueled rockets that require a long and visible fueling process, the Fateh 313 can be launched with very little warning. It is the kind of weapon that arrives almost out of nowhere. It used composite motor casings and advanced guidance systems to reach a circular error probable, its margin of accuracy of less than 10 meters. The missiles boxed in the BACN infrastructure with remarkable precision. One warhead tore through the satellite uplink arrays, another drove straight through the roof of the processing center. The high-tensile steel of those container-sized modules was ripped apart and turned into debris. In a matter of seconds, $500 million worth of battlefield coordination was reduced to scorched ground and ruined electronics. People on the ground did not describe it as a single blast. They described it as a constant physical pressure, like the weight of the impacts pressing down on their chests. Every Fateh 313 strike delivered hundreds of pounds of explosives directly into the heart of the network. By the time the last missile landed, the screens inside the Combined Air Operations Center had gone dark. The universal translator was gone. The intelligence failure was total. We had built a $500 million brain and placed it in a rear position that even a mid-level ballistic power could still reach. Behind those windowless containers at Al-Assad were teams of technicians, signal corps officers, and data specialists working almost entirely out of sight. They are the people who keep the universal translator alive, making sure pilots in the air and troops on the ground can see the same battlefield at the same time. For the veterans who were at Al-Assad during the strike, and for anyone who has ever worked inside a BACN unit, that reality is familiar. When a hidden war suddenly becomes physical, your job is often one of the first things in the crosshairs. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand the E-11A. If the ground station at Al-Assad was the brain, then the E-11A aircraft, a modified Bombardier Global 6000, was the eye. Flying at 40,000 feet, it acted like a high-altitude Wi-Fi router for the entire theater of war. But even the best router means nothing without a connection to the network below. The BACN ground station was that connection. Once Iranian missiles flattened the containers at Al-Assad, the E-11A overhead was effectively cut off. It was still in the air, its sensors were still working, but it had nowhere to send what it was collecting. It was like putting a world-class translator in a room where every microphone had been switched off. The US military does not succeed simply because it has more missiles. It succeeds because its missiles know exactly where to go. That awareness lives inside systems like BACN. Once that system is gone, the kill chain starts to come apart. The real intelligence failure was not just missing the strike. It was failing to see how fragile our connectivity had become. We had concentrated too much power into a single vulnerable node. What remained at Al-Assad was a forensic puzzle. Engineers moved through the wreckage of the BACN ground station, finding fragments of Iranian guidance hardware mixed in with the remains of American servers. Iran had turned one of our biggest strengths into a weakness. They understood that if you take out the translator, the entire force loses its ability to communicate clearly. Then the timeline jumps to April 2024. The setting changes from the shattered site at Al-Assad to the desert near Latakia, Iraq. This time, the intelligence gap appeared to be on the other side. After a precision strike reportedly aimed at an Iranian S-300 long-range surface-to-air radar near Isfahan, photos began circulating online showing unusual metallic debris scattered across the sand. At first, it resembled the remains of a failed missile. It was a large cylindrical body about the size of a telephone pole with a clean separation near the top. But this was not a crash. It looked more like a piece that had been intentionally discarded. Analysis of the debris suggested it was the booster stage of a highly classified two-stage air-launched ballistic weapon. Based on the visible features, the system may have been a Blue Sparrow, or possibly a variant related to the Rampage supersonic standoff missile. The launch profile likely looked something like this. An F-15 or F-15E Strike Eagle takes off and stays well outside Iran's air defense envelope. It never needs to cross the border. From a high-altitude release point, the aircraft deploys the weapon. At that moment, the Blue Sparrow, or whatever closely related system was used, fires its first-stage booster. This is the high-speed sprint phase. The booster drives the weapon to hypersonic velocity and sends it climbing into thinner air, where drag is far lower. Then the key moment happens. Over the Iraqi desert, the heavy booster stage separates and falls away. That is the debris seen in the photographs. What continued toward Iran was something much smaller, harder to track, and moving far faster. That second stage is what made the weapon so difficult to stop. Once the booster dropped away, the missile became a far smaller target, closer to a tiny object on radar, traveling at around Mach 3. The second stage of this mystery, air-launched ballistic weapon, continued on toward Isfahan, using its own hardened autonomous guidance system. It did not depend on a vulnerable command node sitting at a fixed airbase. The target was an S-300 radar, the very system built to defend Iran from this kind of threat. The S-300's flap lid or tombstone radar is extremely capable, but it is designed to detect more conventional threats such as aircraft or larger ballistic missiles. It is not optimized to track a discarded booster falling into Iraq, while a compact supersonic terminal stage comes in from high altitude. The result near Isfahan was a precise shutdown. There was no large area damage and no broad firestorm. The radar simply stopped working. The mystery missile had covered more than 240 miles, the rough distance from New York to Washington, and struck a target roughly the size of a dinner table. The debris found in the desert near Latakia points to a major shift in tactical thinking. When analysts studied photos of the spent booster, one detail stood out immediately: 2 sets of heavy-duty mounting lugs. Those heavy-duty mounting lugs were the physical attachment points used to lock a high-mass weapon onto the underwing pylons of a fighter jet. That detail is the clearest clue of all. It strongly suggests this was not a ground-launched rocket or a conventional cruise missile, but an air-launched ballistic missile, or ALBM. That conclusion fits perfectly with the Rampage concept, a system built to engage hardened, high-value targets such as communications hubs and radar sites while remaining far beyond the reach of enemy interceptors. Rampage operates as a fire-and-forget supersonic impact weapon, essentially a ballistic missile launched from an aircraft instead of a fixed silo. What this debris reveals is a direct answer to the weaknesses exposed at Al-Assad. In 2020, Iran successfully hit a static American nerve center because that center was fixed in place and easy to identify. In 2024, the mystery missile debris found in Iraq suggests that the US and its partners have pushed that logic in a new direction, placing more of the mission-critical capability inside the weapon itself. By using a 2-stage ALBM, such as the Blue Sparrow, or perhaps a specialized Rampage variant, the attacker gains a major advantage through edge-based warfare. The launch aircraft, likely an F-15I Ram or an F-15E Strike Eagle, can release the weapon from a high-altitude standoff position. Because the jet never has to enter the engagement zone of Iranian S-300 batteries, it stays out of reach and out of sight. Distance and altitude solve the vulnerability problem before the target is ever engaged. That is what the world saw lying in the Iraqi desert, a clean mechanical separation with the heavy high-signature booster left behind. What continued toward the target near Isfahan was smaller, quieter, and far more difficult to track. Once the booster dropped away, the remaining vehicle presented a radar signature closer to a tiny object moving at roughly Mach 3, making interception by older radar systems extremely difficult. The missile debris discovered in 2024 is more than abandoned hardware. It is a preview of where warfare is heading over the next decade. The United States and its allies appear to be shifting toward weapons built around edge logic. In the 2020 Al-Assad attack, Iran's Qiyam-1 and Fateh 313 missiles were significant because they showed that a regional power could deliver precise kinetic effects against the infrastructure of a superpower. They proved that our sense of security was deeply tied to our network systems. The response reflected in the mystery weapon found in Iraq feels almost ghost-like. The Blue Sparrow is officially described as a target missile designed to imitate the flight profile of an Iranian Shahab-3. But once you take a missile built to mirror a threat and adapt it with a live combat payload, it becomes something else entirely. A system capable of slipping through the very defenses meant to stop that kind of approach. Rampage, by contrast, is built around speed and impact. It relies on GPS and INS guidance, supported by anti-jamming protection. That is the new reality of the modern battlefield. A missile today is no longer just a flying explosive. It behaves more like a high-speed processor, making its way through electronic interference, signal disruption, and radar deception in order to reach its target. When the S-300 radar near Isfahan was struck, the real success was in the sequence itself. The weapon was launched from a blind spot beyond the border, pushed to supersonic speed to compress the response window, separated from its booster to reduce its radar profile, and then arrived with a level of precision that effectively sidelined the entire air defense battery. That sequence was the direct answer to what happened at Al-Assad. If Iran could reach static American ground stations, then the response was clear. Use weapons that no longer depend on them. The 2020 strike on Al-Assad was a turning point. It exposed a serious gap in how the U.S. military had been thinking about its own battlefield architecture. We had become too confident in the safety of our nerve centers. The assumption was that the world's most advanced force could protect its communication hubs simply by being more advanced than everyone else. Iran proved otherwise. Precision and timing mattered more than raw volume. They did not need to level the entire base. They only had to disable the parts that allowed the system to coordinate itself. But the 2024 mystery strike near Isfahan suggests that lesson did not go ignored. The US and its partners do not appear to be relying only on stronger defenses now. They are developing systems that are harder to detect, harder to predict, and far less dependent on centralized infrastructure. The debris found in the Iraqi desert points to a larger shift, from concentrated control to distributed strike capability. The old model depended on a $500 million ground station to manage the fight. The emerging model puts more autonomy into a weapon that costs a fraction of that and can carry out its mission on its own. The greatest weakness of any $500 million nerve center is simple. It has a fixed location. That is what makes the mystery missile so significant. It has no permanent address. It exists only in motion, in the brief span between release from a wing pylon and arrival at a target. It is the kind of system shaped by the lessons of an intelligence failure, designed so that the next time the eye in the sky goes dark, it is the other side that loses awareness first. What was once an invisible contest is becoming easier to recognize, one discarded booster at a time. The age of the exposed nerve center may be fading. In its place comes the era of the ghost missile. And if 2020 taught anything, it is that the next contest will not be decided by who has the biggest base. It will be decided by whose logic, design, and adaptability can keep functioning under pressure. The Iranian Qiyam-1 may have silenced the translator for a day, but the mystery ALBM suggests the response has already evolved. The nerve center is no longer just a place. It is becoming a trajectory. And if the debris found near Latakia is any indication, that trajectory is changing the future of modern conflict.